Hello, you beautiful mystics, and welcome to this space and time. My name is Gabriel Lugo, and here I talk from self to self. I'm delving today into the mystical aspect of our beingness, this strange experience or reality that somehow seems to be present in all of us. And we find it kind of confusing for our way of thinking, the way we were brought up, and by so many other, I would say, misleading aspects of what is talked about. So please don't take this for a final answer to what mysticism is. As usual, this is just my way of talking about those things that are just simply fascinating for us, the seekers of truth. And as the word mystic derives from mystery, our word for something that cannot be explained, that is unknown, beyond the word itself, there is a meaning, a feeling into what this is. And you see, one of the things that I always say is that we use the words and we don't explore the meaning. We are content with the simple definition that we have, and sometimes that definition gets tainted by the current zeitgeist of our perception of what it means. And it is always good to go back and see what it really means. Why is it mysterious? Why is it that is it a bad thing that is mysterious? Is it something that it's going to makes us uncomfortable because we can't ever describe it? And I think that's where it has its appeal for some and the horrors for others, because of its nature of the unknown. And so, mysterious in which way? The word mystic is simply the experience that cannot be explained. It usually is within the context of somebody having a massive experience that somehow blows their reality, and they call it an awakening. Everything that they have held true at that point not only starts to be questionable, but it becomes unreal. It's almost as if the experience itself is more real than real life, what we call real life. Now, the nature of mystery is something that's interesting to me, because we as modern humans, we want to unveil all mysteries. We want to respond to all the questions. We want to answer every single doubt that we have about reality. And this simply doesn't make sense, because for us to have known or knowledge, we have to have the unknown. So no matter how much we try to know things, the unknown will grow concomitantly. So why would we even care to try to respond all questions, to answer all doubts? And this is why the word mysterious has become a sort of fear for a lot of people. However, for the mystic, it becomes something beautiful inside, something that you start to appreciate the unknown more. And this is why we derive all these ideas of living in the unknown and simply being spontaneous and don't worry about the future. This is all derived from the mystical experience in one way or another. And this mystic part is also easily explained by something that befuddles the mind, which is what in Greek is called apophatic, which is the assertion of something by what it is not. And so when we use the word apophatic, we're trying to define something by denying its definitions, its existence in one way or another. So we're getting into the nature of the mind. You see, the mind can only understand its own way of dividing and separating things. So for the mind to understand anything, it needs to have a contrast. It needs to have a comparative other. And this is just the way our mind works. This is how we perceive reality, because we want to always compare to something. This is where the ego comes in as well. When we identified ourselves with this mechanism that is always comparing and is always trying to see things separate, because that is just the nature of the mind, or the process of the mind, I should say. And so, because we have this inherent in our mind and in our way of perceiving reality, something that is unknown is very puzzling for the mind. And it is unknown because it cannot be explained in way of separation. It must be explained in ways of unity. And this is where the whole of the experience of the mystic is derived from unity. You see, a mystic goes through the process of this blowout that we would call awakening. And this is done not because the individual has done something specific or has practiced something for a certain amount of years, but rather because it is a direct experience, and it happens when it happens. And its own nature being ineffable is what brings about this curiosity, it's almost like we become enamored with this experience that we cannot stop seeing it in our daily lives. This is what is called a transformation to me. When people are transformed, and this can be seen also in similar experiences which are of the psychedelic nature. And this is why it's so difficult to try to put into one term what is the mystical experience, because there are so many ways, and even the idea that it could be derived from a psychedelic experience sometimes is debated because of different ideologies that we might have, and also because there is no direct way of having a mystical experience. It can just happen with anything. It could happen with the death of someone. So it's not specific to anything, like I said, and it's just something that simply happens. And so for a lot of people, this experience reveals what I would call the holy grail for the majority of individuals, if not for everybody. And so anybody who undergoes this experience, this revelation, they see it as the holy grail because it is the way in which we can understand deeply, we can feel rather, what we always wanted, what we all want, which is our shared being, our unity, the dissolution of the separation. And this is also one of the reasons why people who've had this experience, they simply want to share with everybody. They cannot hold them to it themselves. They just want to express it in so many ways. And in doing this, it's it becomes what I call, on the opposite, the horrors for the institutions. Because, you see, institutions are based upon their own individual existence. And when you see that, you can already understand that the word unity for them is threatening. So no matter if it's a corporation or a government or a religious institution, all of them are always afraid and scared of this possibility of unity, of something that we all share together. And they feel threatened. They feel that this is going to dissolve their conglomerate of whatever it is that they do. And you can see that for our modern society, this is not a very useful experience, and it's not a very productive way of living, because it not only reveals the unity in all of us, but also it dissolves all fears of a separate self going through different sufferings and the fear of death and of decay and of financial collapse and anything. All of those fears are dissolved from the mystic, and this is not a good citizen for the world. So this is the part where institutions start fearing these individuals, and they don't want to give credence to them. Yet it is present in all of us. Now, speaking of so much of the background on mysticism and the experience itself and all of this, I want to share with you, before I get into the gradual or sudden experience, because some people may say, well, I have had a gradual experience of understanding reality from this new point of view, and others, which are always the ones that make the newspaper, are the ones who have a sudden awakening, because it's very dramatic. It is something, it's very inspirational as well. But there is no difference between the gradual and the sudden awakening. That is only part of that experience that I already talked about, that really depends on each and one of us. And by sharing my experience, you're going to see that there is a mixture of what I would call the sudden experience and then the gradual one. You see, when I am very grateful that, for reasons that I'll explain in a couple of minutes, I'm very grateful that I grew up as a scientist, and I denied God and religion and spirituality, calling it pseudoscience and imaginary stuff and just woo-woo ideas that humans are inclined to have. And although this all sounds very dry and maybe even not very considerate of my part, it is something that has helped me a lot in my gradual process, and being able to communicate this, discerning between all the different expressions that exist. So, in my experience, what happened was that I started to have a series of experiences that revealed to me that there was something more I wasn't aware of my own self, and by relationship of the whole world, reality, the universe. However, it did happen in a sudden way that is the moment or the point in my history that I called the spiritual awakening. Really appropriate because I had no sense of spirituality at that point. Like I mentioned, I was a scientist and I denied everything that came from spirituality just because of my experience with religion and the Catholic Church. And suddenly I became aware that things were happening in my own experience in reality that I couldn't explain. And they were very real. This was not of the visionary type. This was not of the psychedelic imagery and all of the unknown things or unexplainable experiences that some people have. This was just simply my reality was showing symptoms of a sort of communication of reality to my own mind, which was completely impossible to explain by my rational thinking. It was something that was of a mysterious source. And that led me to want to investigate more. So I opened myself. That's really what happened after that sort of sudden experience. But I wasn't completely convinced. I maintained my skepticism as a scientist. And I began to do research into psychedelics and their effect in the human mind. That led me to consciousness and so on. Some of you might know the full story, but this is what is the gradual experience for me to revealing the mysterious part in me, the mystic in me, which is completely individual and it depends on anybody. So one of the obstacles that I found myself bumping into was the confusing nature of what is expressed out there by so many cultures, religions, belief systems, and communications of all types. This was almost like a child that opens a book and realizes that she doesn't know how to even read and is now presented with this massive amount of information. And I had to make things coherent for me to understand. Now, I understand that this happens because we have, like I said at the beginning, the nature of the mind is to explain things in separate ways, explain things by dividing things. And so by doing so, you can see that even the mystics have had to explain this in ways that were always shrouded in mythological adornment by its cultural paraphernalia. And this, for the new seeker, certainly for me it was confusing. It was very strange for me to try to see the coherence between the Eastern mystics and the Christian mystics and the shamanism and the rest of the information that I was getting even to the Law of One, which was really the first stepping stone for me to start to bring congruency to my own life, to my own experience of what was happening. And this is something that over time you begin to see in everything else. You begin to see in the expression of every single spiritual belief when you get to the core of it, because our ancestors, those mystics in the past, they had to either, one, disguise their understandings so as to avoid the authorities at the time, because, like I said, these institutions have always feared the possibility of somebody creating unity. This is the reason why Jesus was crucified, and consequently, ironically, all his students, apostles, simply students of reality, were also persecuted because they were speaking from Gnosis. The Gnostics were all wiped out, to the point that all their books, everything that they wrote, because it was against the possibility of the institutionalized religion that was coming about in Christianity, it was threatening for them. And so many of them had to disguise their words and disguise their teachings in ways that were confusing for the one who didn't know, who wasn't an initiate. And all our lives, all our past history has been then shrouded in some mystery of one kind or another. And in the East, where this has been commonplace, a common ground for anybody, this over time has become, again, shrouded by mythological explanations of everything. And so we have so many gods and so many systems of yogi traditions and ways of connecting with the divine that for somebody who didn't grow up in that culture, it becomes daunting. And it is, instead of making it possible for anybody, it becomes a challenge and a deterrent for a lot, because it is just simply a product of a culture. So what is left is that, well, to be fair, Buddhism is, however, the best way we have to export the Eastern mysticism of the Chinese in the Tao, or the Hinduists in their Advaita, their non-duality. And so when we realize this, we find that even in those, we can see the nature of mysticism and the nature of unity, which is really what we're all looking for. And the answer to all of our questions, fears, and problems is that tapping into that inner self, tapping into that one thing that we all share together, and that is the mystical approach to life, to begin to reveal that. And one of the things that is common in all people who have this awakening, this beginning of the seeking of the self, is that we begin to be drawn by the need for isolation. It is very characteristic of this experience. And whether this is intentional, or what I would call the reactivity of the mind as it seeks and approaches truth, I'm not really sure. But what I'm sure is that this happens, this seeking of isolation happens, and is a product of the need to find the essence, or rather, it is the essence pulling, as gravity would. We could call it even spiritual gravity, because as I have alluded already, you can see that there is no way to explain this directly. There is no way to transmit the mystical experience. all we can do is talk about it. All we can do is create mythology, analogy, or some sort of reference to it. And this is in an effort to communicate it. And this is why, again, when we read mystics, we find it in so many different ways, but it is the same thing. They're all talking about the same experience of unity, of dissolution, of any problem. And this spiritual gravity that I would call is the seeking of isolation is because since we cannot explain it, we need to find it within ourselves. And to find it within ourselves, we need to first stop identifying with anything that we are. We need to shed all those layers of the apparent self that we are, or that we pretend to be. And so, by doing this, you start to find the apophatic method that I mentioned earlier, the via negativa, that is the negation of everything that we are. And again, this is not a system. It is what happens. To say that this is the way to elicit a mystical experience is wrong. It is just that the mystical seeking undergoes this process of shedding those layers of the apparent self to reveal what? The unknown, the mysterious, the silence, the vacuum, the void, where nothing exists, or better yet, no thing exists. Therefore, that vacuum, that silence, is the nature of all things. Just like all words come out of silence, or all objects exist in space, so all things, anything that we can think of, anything that the mind can process, comes from this void. And it's really not a void in itself. It is what Ra calls a plenum. It is the extent of infinity. It is the field of consciousness where we all derive our existence, our manifestation into the universe. And everything derives its essence from there too. If all words come from silence, then all things come from consciousness. All minds come from consciousness. And this is the final experience. This is where the mystic finds God, because not in the cultural God that could be the different gods in the shamanic systems or the shamanic cultures, or God in the Jehovah sense, or God in the Brahman way. It is simply God in the word that underlies everything in our reality. It is that pure essence in which everything comes out and dissolves into. And the beauty of this is that our own mind is the first step, is the first indicative that this is possible, that this is not achieved by any external means, but by own self-exploration, or what is called self-inquiry, which is asking, what is the nature of the mind? What is the essence of myself? All of these questions are going to reveal that the mind is simply vibrations, like words are vibrations. And all of them, everything, every single vibration of the mind is coming from consciousness, because anything that the mind produces is known, and that knowing is what we call consciousness. We are conscious of everything. We are always knowing everything. And so that field of knowing is what we call consciousness. This is why the mystic in you is simply that silence, that void that we call, which I rather call it plenum, and that is always you. And the mind is simply the activity of chiseling, if you will, reality. The mind is doing this for experience, because experience can only be had when we create an illusion, or rather a game in which we play to be separate. And by doing this, the mind can provide consciousness with experience, which is not fully true in semantics, because when we say that the mind is providing something to consciousness, it seems like it's separated. But as I teach in my way to explain the direct path, there is the concession of mind and consciousness as separate in the beginning stages of exploration of the self, but later on we find that they both dissolve, because there is no mind and consciousness separated. There is only the knowing of anything. There is only consciousness, and this is the consciousness only model that goes away with all the mysticism, or rather the products of mysticism that we call that cultural arrangement of mythological figures and gods and strange magic happening in different ways. It goes straight to the heart, and it's my preferred method. So when we think about mysticism, we shouldn't think about it in terms of something that is too mysterious for us mortals to delve into, but rather as something that it simply lies within us, and that is achievable only if we decide to shed those layers that we think we are and experience, first to reveal that pure essence of consciousness that we are, and then to reveal that one self that we all share and is our shared being. So with that, I come to the end of this episode. I'm always grateful of you listening to this and enjoying these ramblings of my mind as I try to continue to express and communicate my experiences, especially with mysticism. So I thank you again, and I'll catch you on the next one.